Ever since I posted my first free-to-play PvP build based on the Hydrogen Escort, I've gotten a number of requests to build a free-to-play science build too. My original plan was to build this on the Fleet Nova, which I blew some of my character's T6 fleet modules on, and while I still have ideas for that build, I really think the best option for a freely available ship is the Fleet Scryer, which offers intel seating. Even before the intel revamp, I had started working on this build, and I posted a match in it just last month. Now that intel is even more powerful, it's really hard to ignore, so I've adjusted this build accordingly. A few notes before I get started. I had to make a number of concessions and test a lot of different theories on this one. Generally, for players just getting into PvP, flying a fast pilot ship or a big cruiser and just focusing on traditional damage is probably the way to start out, because it's an easier concept to understand and easier to build for. With PvP, there's a lot more than just whoever has the most damage at the end of the match screen, and I think that's one of the hardest things to explain, especially to PvE players. When flying a science build like this, you're doing a lot of area of effect damage, not necessarily damage directly to players themselves, so you might look really good on a parse, but actually be one of the least effective ships in the match, because your damage is being dealt to pets and stuff that doesn't matter. On the other hand, you might do very little damage, but if you're able to constantly hold, disable, and slow down enemy ships, you can set them up to be easy kills by your teammates, and that can have a much bigger impact on the outcome of a match than raw damage itself. I also really wanted to make a different method of healing work here. I tested the Fleet Embassy hull repair consoles, which are extremely high performers on other builds, as well as just using concealed repairs, plus I contemplated saving up for traits like secret command codes or ablative shell, and just doing my healing through traits only, but ultimately the problem was that I couldn't build up enough of a barrier to avoid being one-shotted by high damage dogfighter builds. On my main account, I do successfully have builds based on trait healing only, which frees up a lot of console slots, but I have access to a lot more event and Zen gear there, so that helps make that idea work. So here we are again with another build utilizing temporary hull and protomatter tactical consoles, which does limit our options as far as other consoles we could use offensively. But like I always say, a dead ship does no damage. Alright, on to the gear. I already mentioned I'm using protomatter colony consoles for the bulk of my healing, which means I'm forced into using two abilities that trigger them. Technical overload from the Lucari Pizia Polaron is not affected by weapon power, so that's my first weapon since I'm using beam overload anyway. My next two are mainly used for their procs. The Nausicaan Energy Torpedo has a hold effect, which when it hits is good enough to strip off certain buffs like DPRM or molecular phase inversion, and the Plasma Particle Emission Torpedo, which leaves behind a cloud that both slows enemies and scales from our EPG. I'd also seriously consider slotting the Gamma Wide-Angle Chronoton Torpedo, which also has a great slow effect, or the Agony Torpedo, which has a disable. The Emission Torpedo frustratingly says that it disables Cloak, but it doesn't, so chalk that up to another bug that reduces this weapon's effectiveness. In the rear, I have the Gamma Inhibiting Phaser Omni Beam, which provides a -10 damage resistance debuff to anything moving slower than us, and it also has a chance to knock engines offline. In my other rear slots, I have two random inhibiting Polaron turrets that drop for free from Gamma reputation boxes while I was leveling up. These have the same chance to knock engines offline, but there are plenty of better options that could go here, or at the very least, I could grab the Advanced Inhibiting Turret too, which would add on to the debuff the Omni is already doing. I want to stress that part of the point of these free-to-play builds is that I want to show just how minimal the effort would be to put together a decent PvP build, so some things that could be better I intentionally ignore because I don't really play this character very much, and I don't have time to spend grinding for it. My other gear is my usual preferred setup with a 3-piece competitive set, made up of the deflector, engines, and shields. This provides a nice bonus damage resistance against other energy builds. And it also frees up my warp core, where I'm using the temporal core for a trajector jump, which is a little clicky ability that teleports my ship forward out of trouble when timed correctly. Alternatively, I could use a competitive core, and that frees up my deflector for something like this Control ×5 Gem Hadar deflector, which would both improve my control abilities as well as increase stealth detection, so that's an option for a more offensive configuration. I'm using an inhibiting secondary deflector, which provides a large radiation damage hit after a 4-second delay. This does not count as a damage over time effect, so it doesn't get cleared off constantly like the deteriorating deflector would. I'd rather go with guaranteed damage than hope I catch someone in between dot cleanses, so I went with inhibiting on this build. As for other consoles, any slot I could fill with a protomatter console has one of those. I also have hull image refractors for more temporary hull, and this Pax Triburnium console for extra hull capacity and resistances. Then I have both the fluidic phase decoupler and molecular phase inversion consoles for escaping sticky situations. Fluidic has the added advantage of being able to activate even while disabled or held, so that's why I'm using that now instead of Warp Burst Capacitor. On the more offensive side, I have Akar's Vengeance, which deals a fairly large shield-penetrating electrical hit, as well as disabling subsystems, Hostile Acquisition, which holds and debuffs, and Parasitic Ice, which can be used to lock someone down. The last slot is a Fleet Research Lab Particle Focuser, which increases EPG and control and can give me some nice bonus exotic damage too. I'd call this last slot a Flex console, so I could use another Escape console or maybe another Universal console from the exchange that has some kind of debuff or disable effect like Approaching Agony. My specializations are Command as primary, mainly for boost morale, which clears all debuffs for the whole team. I usually save this for clearing my own disable, or if I'm safe, I can use it to help out a teammate. Miracle Worker is my secondary, which automatically clears drains and damage over time effects frequently, and gives us some additional resistances when healing, which should be always. I could get additional temporary hull by setting Strategist as my secondary and Miracle Worker as my primary, but then I'm at risk for being disabled or otherwise debuffs and having no way to clear it. With intel disables like Evade Target Lock being so prevalent, I think Command is the way to go for now. Let's talk traits. I've been saving up for a while to be able to afford this stuff, but a couple of lucky EC-filled Endeavor boxes and grinding a few patrols and I was able to snag a couple of great traits. I have both Fresh from R&R and Smuggler's Luck, which automatically clear control effects. Fresh from R&R also has the benefit of allowing me to activate Intel Team every 10 seconds. On the defensive side, I have Give Your All, which dodges 20% of incoming damage, and Redirected Armor Plating, which is free from a single-player mission and provides 30 more damage resistance rating. I grabbed Pseudo Submission a while ago for the Dogfighter build on the same character for around 10 million, so that's still part of this build, and I also spotted Reconstructive Radiation cheap, so I grabbed that too, which provides a heal and damage over time cleanse. I'm not sure Reconstructive is the best option here. I see traits like Principled Insubordination and Redundant Animator Containment up for only a few million, and those might be better choices overall. On the offensive side of things, this is a science build, so I'm of course using Particle Manipulator. Since this is a Gem Hadar character, I had that unlocked right off the bat from creating a new character, so that's an easy choice. And since I'm a science captain too, I'm also using Conservation of Energy, which adds bonus exotic damage when I take incoming fire. The main two traits I spent so much time saving up for are Intelligence Agent Attaché, which helps me get off my captain abilities more frequently, and Unconventional Systems, which helps me use my Universal Consoles more often. Since I have quite a few Universal Consoles on this build and lots of control effects, that trait is incredibly helpful for this build. I also want to mention that a lot of players in my Armada and community have offered to give me traits and equipment like the Boimler effect and so on. I really appreciate those offers, but I couldn't accept them because the point of this series of builds is to prove that even players who might not have such an uplifting and helpful community can still get involved in PvP. There are also plenty of people who watch these free-to-play videos who have far more in terms of gear and equipment, so hopefully those players can extrapolate from this some ideas or improvements they can make to their own builds. Starship traits are next. I have Honored Dead, which I snagged off the exchange, but this trait honestly has been very underwhelming. Watching back footage from my matches, this trait is really not that effective because damage taken to temporary hull does not count for increasing it. This means that if I'm in my temporary HP pool the whole match, even if I take millions in incoming damage, I'll never get a single stack from this trait. I can see situations where it could be useful, but all I'm saying is if you're watching this video a year from now and Honored Dead is 100 million or something, don't feel obligated to go pay for that because it's really not a big part of this build. Next is Concealed Repairs, which is a nice and easy boost to healing and cooldowns. I also have Pilfered Power, available from the same box, which drains weapons and auxiliary power from my enemy and gives it to me. I think traits like Critical Systems or maybe the Eisenberg trait could be better choices in this slot too. I'm not sure the drain from Pilfered is really doing much, and it has a very short duration. Improved Gravity Well helps keep our Gravity Wells out there for a while, and it also applies a damage resistance debuff to our main target. This trait is one of the reasons why I chose the Andorian Shemesh with my free T6 coupon that was given out earlier this year. Then I have Improved Pedal to the Metal. I'm very close to unlocking Superior, but like I said, I just don't play this character all that much, so it'll take a while to work up to. The last is Carrier Wave Shield Hacking, which dipped under 1 million EC just recently, so it's a great way to set up an enemy ship to take more damage by disabling their shields. My reputation traits are mostly defensive: Evasive Tactics to clear control effects, and Advanced Hull Reinforcement for additional bonus damage resist. Aux Power Config Defense for even more resistances and hull capacity, and Automated Protomatter Conduits for high regen in case I'm in trouble. The only offensive trait choice I've really made here is Viral Engines Overload, which slows down and disables the engines of enemy ships. Another offensive option would be Enhanced Sensors, which improves control and drain effectiveness after activating a captain ability. Now for the Bridge Officer layout. I'll start with the easy one. This LT Tactical seat has both Beam Overload and Cannon Scatter Volley. Beam Overload triggers both the heals as well as Technical Overload from the Lucari Beam, and Cannon Scatter is used to activate the heals a second time and cover some area with the inhibiting turrets. If I had fancier traits and didn't need to depend on Protomatter consoles for healing, I might slot more intel abilities in this seat, or maybe Torpedo Spread, since Torpedo Spreads always hit regardless of accuracy. The Engineering seat is really the bare minimum. Engineering Team to clear debuffs, Aux to Dampers for disable immunity, and Emergency Power to Engines for the speed. There is an Ensign Universal seat that I'm using here for Science Team, which is another debuff cleanse that's required on almost any PvP build. I did consider swapping this for an Engineer so I could have a second Emergency Power ability here, but then I'd have to give up another Science ability elsewhere, so ultimately I didn't go that route, but it could be an option. I'll start with the Science Lieutenant Commander, which has Tractor Beam, which triggers Carrier Wave Shield Hacking, and Scramble Sensors, which I have a Duty Officer for. That combo can be quite annoying for other players, and then Photonic Officer 2 is in this seat as well to ensure I have everything as close to global cooldown as possible. Now for the Commander Science and Intel seat. The only science ability I have here is Gravity Well 3. This is the primary control effect of this build and is mainly used to pull and slow enemy ships, as well as cluster their pets and summons and make them easier to be killed off. Next is Evade Target Lock 3, which currently has a very long disable duration and can be used to make it very difficult for someone to activate things on their tray if they don't have some kind of disable immunity or clear. Ionic Turbulence is in the Lieutenant seat. The hold effect from this also locks out a target's tray, and since the revamp, it also counts as a control effect, which is nice for unconventional systems. It does not trigger secondary deflectors though, so ignore the patch notes that say that it does because that's a lie. The last Intel ability is Intel Team, which is a defensive measure to help avoid being targeted. I'd also like to present an alternative layout designed to deal with other ships using Intel Team, Exitus, and so on. In this layout, I've switched to Intel Team 3, which provides 350 perception, and I've given up Scramble Sensors so that I can slot Emergency Power to Aux 3, which is another 250 perception. To really cap off this build, I'd slot the Jem'Hadar Deflector and Tachyon Detection Grid Console as well. Offensive output suffers a bit, but that's over 6,100 perception, which should be enough to target Exodus ships out to around 5 kilometers. Not bad for a free-to-play build. The last thing are Duty Officers. I'm using a Con Officer from the Phoenix box to recharge evasive maneuvers, a Matter-Antimatter Specialist to keep Aux to Damp up 100% of the time, and a blue Warp Core Engineer that clears debuffs when using emergency power abilities. This Warp Core Engineer is highly effective, and with blues running less than 5 million right now, I'd highly recommend scooping one up before people catch on. The purple is more expensive at around 40 million, but that's an option too if you're ritzy. 47 of 47 I grabbed for less than 5 million too, but I've been told these got a lot more expensive. This is just here to try to get my cooldowns up better, but with Photonic Officer 2, I'm not sure it's really necessary, although I think there would be some gaps without it. Then I'm using a purple Aftershock Gravity Well Officer to help with AoE control and damage, and this one comes for free by making a Jem'Hadar character. The last one, Segus, messes with recharge timers when targets are hit with scramble sensors, although that effect gets cleared very quickly, so this is probably the least effective officer on this list. I hope that helps give people ideas for their own PvP science builds and how they work, and if you have other gear or didn't miss any events like I have, be sure to use that equipment to your advantage. The Tholian Web Spinner is another great console that I missed that would be great on this build, so just look for other consoles and abilities that have effects like Disable, Slow, and Hold to see what you can do, and especially if you have a teammate in a beam build, it can be a ton of fun working together to crack through other players' defenses. Thanks for watching.